Welcome to this presentation by the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia to celebrate America's 250th anniversary. We will explore Abraham Lincoln's empowering reverence for the Declaration of Independence as the engine for making America, in his words, forever worthy of saving. Thank you for joining us. It has been 250 years since the United States was born with the unprecedented declaration that all men are created equal. This painting by John Trumbull depicts the drafting committee led by Thomas Jefferson as they present their work for consideration to the Continental Congress. After 2 days of debate and modifications, the Congress immediately approved, unanimously, the document and ordered it publicly proclaimed. This was the first document issued under the name of the United States of America. Sadly, the Declaration's statement of birthright went unheeded for more than half of America's population. People of African descent, women, and white men without property. This presentation by the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia will examine selected speeches and letters to demonstrate how Abraham Lincoln built a political movement for freedom around the sentiments of the Declaration. Its powerful core has been described as the greatest sentence ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln led the first major effort after the 1787 Constitutional Convention toward making its promise of universal equality a reality in this country for, as he hoped, all time to come. Lincoln firmly bonded the stirring motto with the fundamental law, the U.S. Constitution. His leadership resulted in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. His success created the foundation for the succession of future acts that expanded human rights in America. For this, the Lincoln Group honors Abraham Lincoln to be included among the fathers of his country. He led a political revolution that culminated in the Civil War and the end of racial enslavement in this country. The 3 Reconstruction Amendments ended involuntary servitude, ordered birthright citizenship, and mandated voting and civil rights throughout the country. The fuller realization of these principles will take another 50 years to include women and 100 years to resolve the major issues of African American civil rights. But Lincoln opened the path to pursue these and other questions about expanding the application of human rights in America. My name is John O'Brien. I'm a past president of the Lincoln Group, and I write on Lincoln's faith and the 19th century culture of religion in America. Our panel of distinguished Lincoln Group scholars and writers for this discussion include Lincoln Group President Ed Epstein, Dr. Edna Greene Medford, Jeffrey Boutwell, Dr. Thomas Horrocks, and David Kent. They will analyze several Lincoln documents that demonstrate his commitment throughout his political life to ending slavery as the first step toward our comprehensive enjoyment of the principles of the Declaration. These documents trace Lincoln's career as he brought together a broad coalition that elected him president. The new Republican Party was not committed to ending slavery where it already existed, but simply to stopping its spread into the new states and territories. Lincoln believed that non-extension of slavery would result in its eventual demise. Those who drove secession were intent on absolutely preserving the right to take their human property anywhere within the United States and its territories. To preserve that right, they first divided the Democratic Party over allowing people to vote on the matter, and then they divided the nation because of Lincoln's election. Lincoln was steadfast in upholding the principles of the Declaration, even while facing the immediate prospect of civil war. Alexander Stephens served with Lincoln in Congress and was the vice president of the Confederate States. Stephens spoke about how the founding principle of the Confederate government was different from the Northern idea of human equality. Excerpts from the so-called Cornerstone speech show the stark difference with Lincoln. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea, Stephens said. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. They assume that the Negro is equal and hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. They are attempting to make things equal which the Creator had made unequal. With us, all the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eye of the law. Not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place. He, by nature or by the curse against Canaan, is fitted for that condition which he occupies in our system. God has made one race to differ from another. The great objects of humanity are best attained when there is conformity to God's laws and decrees. Our confederacy is founded upon principles in strict conformity with these laws. The principle has become the real cornerstone of our new edifice. Shortly after Lincoln's election, Stevens wrote to him as a former colleague using the language of the 25th proverb in the Bible, hoping for a word fitly spoken about compromise that might prevent secession. Lincoln politely repeated his assurance that he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the states where it existed, and the South was in no danger from him. Lincoln then described the only substantial difference between their positions. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. This request from Stevens prompted Lincoln to describe a metaphor to clarify his thinking on the ultimate value of his country. He reflected on the Constitution and the Union as the foundations of national success. However, he wrote, there is something behind these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, that gives hope for all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry for all. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better, more than a mere change of masters. The assertion of that principle, of that time, that all men are created equal, was the word fitly spoken which has proved the apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture is made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Not only was the Constitution required to uphold the principle of liberty for all, it likely would not have been possible at all without the language of the Declaration. This sentiment was not an inspiration of the moment, but the culmination of Lincoln's sustained belief in the power of this core principle as an example for the world. The first presenter is David J. Kent, a Lincoln historian and past president of the Lincoln Group of D.C. He is the author of several books on Abraham Lincoln and other historical figures. His latest book is Lincoln in New England, In Search of His Forgotten Tours.
Thank you, John. So Abraham Lincoln had been out of political office for 5 years when in 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas pushed through passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The act opened all the Western territories gained from the Mexican War to the possibility of slavery, and it repealed the Missouri Compromise that had barred slavery from the Northern territories remaining from Louisiana Purchase. The act codified Douglas's contention that the white residents of a territory could elect to have slavery if they so wanted. To Lincoln, this act reversed the intent of the founders, who thought that they had put the nation on a path toward the ultimate extinction of this most abhorrent institution. The Kansas-Nebraska Act jarred Lincoln back into politics, leading him to seek a political office where he could rekindle the founders' belief in the fundamental principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence. So on October 16th, 1854, Lincoln gave a speech in Peoria, Illinois, that laid out his critique of the Kansas-Nebraska Act on moral, political, legal, and historical grounds. He reiterated and updated these concepts in an early 1860 speech in Hartford, Connecticut, during his second speaking tour of New England. Now, both these speeches are long, but the following provides some key points relevant to the nation's founding. So Lincoln gives a detailed overview of the legal and historical precedent for the federal policy of restricting slavery. He shows that Douglas is denying the reality that the policy of prohibiting slavery in the new territories originated with Thomas Jefferson. It was Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, who proposed the idea of ceding the Northwest Territories to the federal government and barring slavery from the region. So contrary to Douglas's assertions, the federal government had worked hard to limit the expansion of slavery, noting not only the Northwest Ordinance, but also the ending of the international slave trade, the Missouri Compromise, the Wilmot Proviso, and the Compromise of 1850, the latter of which including ending the slave trade in the federal territory of the District of Columbia. So Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act reversed the intent of the founders. Lincoln also questioned Douglas's claims of indifference to whether slavery expanded or not. So he argued this declared indifference, but as I must think, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. So Lincoln points out that the framers intentionally use euphemisms like persons held to service or labor instead of the words slave or slavery. And he explains why. He says, thus the thing is hid away in the Constitution, just as an afflicted man hides away a wen or a cancer, which he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death, with the promise, nevertheless, that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time. The founders, Lincoln is saying, created a framework under which future leaders could eventually end slavery. So he goes on, but this is not all. The earliest Congress under the Constitution took the same view of slavery. While they couldn't eliminate it at the time, they hedged and hemmed it into the narrowest limits of necessity. So whereas the founders sought to put slavery on a path to its ultimate extinction, the Kansas-Nebraska bill brought it back. Once slavery was called a necessary evil that through the reality of its existing presence required its forbearance in order to create a constitutional union, the South now calls slavery a positive good and threatens to destroy that union unless the North speaks and acts as if slavery were right. No, Lincoln argues, slavery is wrong, and we should return to our ancient faith of the founders' intent rather than replace it with a new faith of popular sovereignty. So Lincoln goes on in his speech to reiterate this shift. He says, but now slavery is to be transformed into a sacred right. Henceforth, it is to be the chief jewel of the nation, the very figurehead of the ship of state. Little by little, but steadily as man's march to the grave, we have been giving up the old for the new faith. Now, near 80 years ago, we began by declaring that all men were created equal. But now, from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. These principles cannot stand together. They are the opposite as God and mammon, and whoever holds to the one must despise the other. So Lincoln goes on to give an example of how the South has reversed the founders' intentions. When Senator Pettit, in connection with his support of the Kansas-Nebraska bill, called the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie, of the 40-odd pro-Kansas-Nebraska senators who sat present and heard him, no one rebuked him. nor am I apprised that any Kansas, Nebraska newspaper or any Kansas, Nebraska orator in the whole nation has ever yet rebuked him. And yet, if it had been said in Old Independence Hall 78 years ago, the very doorkeeper would have throttled the man and thrust him into the street. Let no one be deceived, Lincoln continues. The spirit of 76 and the spirit of Kansas, Nebraska are utter antagonisms, and the former is being rapidly displaced by the latter. He goes on to say, fellow countrymen, American South as well as North, shall we make no effort to arrest this? So Lincoln goes on to point out that our allies around the world are warning us of our internal dangers. They express their apprehension that the one retrograde institution in America is undermining the principles of progress and fatally violating the noblest political system the world ever saw. This is not the taunt of enemies, but the warning of friends. Is it quite safe to disregard it, to despise it? Is there no danger to liberty itself in discarding the earliest practice, the first precept of our English ancient faith? In our greedy chase to make profit of the Negro, let us beware lest we cancel and tear to pieces even the white man's charter of freedom. So Lincoln calls for the United States to return to the principles of the founders in words that should resonate with all Americans today. He says, our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal claims and its arguments of necessity. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. Let North and South, let all Americans, let all lovers of liberty everywhere join in this great and good work. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, we shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. Thank you.
And Ed Epstein is president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia and a writer for the Lincolnian.org website. A retired journalist, he has collaborated with many government and private history organizations for events to interpret Lincoln and his role in history.
Thank you, John, so much. The Dred Scott decision issued by the U.S. Supreme Court on March 6, 1857, stands as perhaps the most odious decision ever to come out of the High Court. To Abraham Lincoln, the ruling's finding that African Americans were not U.S. citizens and did not enjoy any of the rights and protections under the Constitution was an abomination. The court twisted the promise of Lincoln's beloved Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, into a cruel hoax that had to be resisted and eventually overturned. To the coolly rational Lincoln, the decision was part of a vast, powerful conspiracy to legalize slavery across the country. It was based on falsehoods and deliberate distortions of the nation's founding documents. While Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said that the right to own slaves was explicitly spelled out in the Constitution, Lincoln recoiled, saying that the Constitution never used the word slave or slavery and never referred to slaves as property. The ruling said that the Declaration's promises were meant for the white colonists seeking to overthrow King George III, implying that the Declaration wasn't a promise for all time to come. The Dred Scott decision, like the Compromise of 1850, which included the inflammatory Fugitive Slave Act and later the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, stirred Lincoln into more forceful anti-slavery political activity. particularly as he prepared to try to unseat Illinois' powerful Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas in the campaign of 1858. The Scott decision was at the time one of the most complicated and lengthy rulings yet issued by the High Court. Tawney and all the justices weighed in with separate opinions in the 7-2 decision. So it took time for anger to build across the North as people digested the ruling. It wasn't until June 26, 1857, that Lincoln let loose on the Scott ruling. 2 weeks before, Douglas spoke in Springfield, defending the decision and saying that blacks weren't included in the promise of the Declaration, were an inferior race, and charging that Republicans favored, quote, the amalgamation, unquote, of the races. Lincoln responded in a speech in the House of Representatives chamber in the state capitol. You can sense the controlled anger in his words defending the Declaration. Our Declaration of Independence was held sacred by all and thought to include all, he said. But now, to aid in making the bondage of the Negro universal and eternal and hawked at and torn until its framers could rise from their graves, they could not recognize it. Lincoln was just warming up and now uttered one of his most famous phrases as he looked at the plight of the millions of slaves. All the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against him. Mammon is after him. Ambition follows, and the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. Lincoln biographer Sidney Blumenthal took the phrase, all the powers of earth, as the title of the 3rd volume of his projected 5-volume life of Lincoln. Writing of the phrase, he wrote, the slave power was the ultimate political power that Lincoln contemplated. If all the powers of earth were against the slave, they were also arrayed against those against slavery. It was not only the slave held captive, but the country. Almost exactly a year later, Illinois Republicans formally nominated Lincoln as their candidate for the Senate against Douglas. His acceptance produced another of his famous phrases, a ringing warning about the nation's looming crisis over slavery. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot permanently endure half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. Lincoln firmly opposed Douglas's concept of popular sovereignty, but unlike other Republican critics who argued with Douglas over the mechanics of allowing residents of the Kansas and Nebraska territories to vote on allowing slavery, Lincoln opposed popular sovereignty because it violated the spirit of the nation's founding by allowing the expansion of slavery. Douglas sold popular sovereignty as an exemplar of safe government, but Lincoln attacked it as a perversion of American ideals and the promise of the Declaration. Despite Dred Scott, he said it was evident that blacks were entitled to equal rights. In July 1858, Lincoln spoke in Chicago. He assailed Douglas for having said that the Declaration applied only to white Anglo-Saxon men of means. What about all the immigrants who had poured into the new country since 1776? He said those people have a right to claim it, quote, as though they were the blood of the blood and the flesh of the men who wrote that Declaration. Lincoln also slammed Douglas's appeal to the basest fears by suggesting that Republicans wanted to take women as their wives. Lincoln said that just because I do not want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for one or the other. I can just leave her alone. And he added, in some respects, she is certainly not my equal, but in her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of anyone else, she is my equal and the equal of others. That, Lincoln said, was what he called the electric cord in the Declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. Lincoln returned again and again to what he saw as the unfulfilled promise of the Declaration, the document that was his political cornerstone. Contrary to the erroneous Dred Scott ruling, Lincoln contended, I had thought the Declaration contemplated the progressive improvement in the condition of all men everywhere. That was true in 1857 and 58 in the immediate aftermath of Judge Taney's dark vision. And it is just as true today as we seek to keep Lincoln alive through his vision of a society of equality and opportunity for all. Thank you, John.
Jeffrey Boutwell is retired from a career in public policy. He has a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His recent book is Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy. It is a biography of his ancestor, George Boutwell, who was a political ally and friend of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant in promoting equality of rights and opportunity for all Americans.
Thank you, John. In April 1859, Abraham Lincoln set forth his views on the importance of the founding principles of the Declaration of Independence in a little-known letter to a political meeting in Boston that would help propel him to the presidency. The occasion was that year's Thomas Jefferson birthday dinner organized by the Massachusetts Republican Party, held at the famed Parker House Hotel in Boston. Chaired by George Boutwell, former Massachusetts governor and Lincoln's future revenue commissioner, those attending included U.S. Senator Henry Wilson and Carl Schurz, future Civil War general and senator from Missouri. Anticipation that spring was already building toward the 1860 presidential election. Frontrunners for the Republican nomination for president, including Senator William Seward of New York and Governor Salmon Chase of Ohio, sent letters of regret at being unable to attend, as did Representative Francis Blair of Missouri on behalf of a likely third candidate, Edward Bates. Abe Lincoln was a name that was not yet in the mix, though his Illinois debates in 1858 with Senator Stephen Douglas had certainly raised his political profile. In his opening remarks that day, former Governor Boutwell declared that the great issue of slavery is upon us. We cannot escape it, paying tribute to Thomas Jefferson's belief that the rights of man were superior to those of states, and contrasting the free labor society of the North with the servitude of Southern plantation agriculture. Boutwell called for the extinction of an institution dangerous to the welfare of the people and hostile to the perpetuity of the Union. In the spring of 1859, Abraham Lincoln could not yet be so explicit about slavery if he wanted to remain a viable candidate for the Republican nomination for president the following year. What was clear, however, was that Lincoln viewed slavery as a long-term existential threat to the Union. For Lincoln, as for Boutwell, the institution of slavery was anathema to notions of Republican government based on the consent of the governed. In the coming years, Lincoln would act on those beliefs in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation and supporting the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, while Boutwell, as a member of Congress, would help write and enact the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Back in Boston, Boutwell's remarks were followed by a reading of the letters from Seward, Chase, Blair, and Lincoln, all of them apologizing for not being able to attend. The gist of Lincoln's letter was simple. He pointed out how Thomas Jefferson's original devotion to the personal rights of man, holding the rights of property to be secondary only, was now the credo of the Republican Party, not the Democrats. The latter, he said, now hold the liberty of one man to be absolutely nothing when in conflict with another man's right of property. Republicans, on the contrary, are for both the man and the dollar, but in cases of conflict, the man before the dollar. The irony of Republicans in Massachusetts, political heirs to John Adams and the Federalist Party of the 1790s, paying homage to Jefferson, Adams' arch nemesis, was not lost on anyone. As he often did, Lincoln used a humorous story to illustrate this switch in Republican and Democratic ideologies. Lincoln wrote, I remember once being much amused at seeing two partially intoxicated men engage in a fight with their greatcoats on, which fight, after a long and rather harmless contest, ended in each having fought himself out of his own coat and into that of the other. If the two leading parties of this day are really identical with the two in the days of Jefferson and Adams, they have performed the same feat as the two drunken men. But soberly, Lincoln then added, it is now no child's play to save the principles of Jefferson from total overthrow in this nation. Driving his point home, Lincoln emphasized the centrality of the Declaration of Independence and its abstract truth of equality, applicable to all men and all times, as a fundamental truth of the American experiment in democracy. Then followed one of Lincoln's most enduring phrases. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. As described by Lincoln biographer Ronald C. White, Lincoln's compelling words would receive wide circulation in the Republican press. Momentum for his candidacy was building that would ultimately result in Lincoln winning the Republican nomination for president in May of 1860 and being elected our nation's 16th president the following November.
So Thomas Horrocks is an independence scholar with a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. He is editor-in-chief of the Lincoln Herald and has published 8 books primarily on Abraham Lincoln and American politics. His latest book will be published in 2027 under the title Abraham Lincoln in 50 Objects, Episodes in the Life of Our Nation's Greatest President.
Thank you, John. During Lincoln's train journey from Springfield, Illinois, to the nation's capital to assume the presidency, he stopped in Trenton, New Jersey, on February 21st, 1861, to address the state Senate. In his remarks, Lincoln recalled reading Mason Locke Weems's Life of George Washington as a young boy. Lincoln told the senators that he was enthralled by the battles, especially the, quote, struggle here at Trenton, unquote, by Washington's army, which impressed him, quote, more than any single revolutionary event. I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than a common that those men struggled for. That's something even more than national independence. That's something that held out great promise to all people of the world, to all time to come. I am exceedingly anxious, Lincoln continued, that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. And I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty, and of this, his almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle, unquote. As he declared at the next stop on his train journey, Lincoln was willing to give his life, if that's what it took, to perpetuate the object of that great struggle. The day after he delivered his remarks in Trenton, Lincoln visited Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the building in which the founders drafted and adopted the Declaration of Independence. Despite being informed the evening before of an assassination attempt awaiting him at Baltimore, Lincoln refused to cut short his planned visit to Independence Hall, a place considered by Lincoln to be sacred because it was the place where the historic document that he revered was created. Clearly affected by his visit, Lincoln delivered emotional and heartfelt remarks, emphasizing his devotion to the Declaration and the principles it embodied. Undoubtedly thinking of the disconcerting news he received the night before, Lincoln avowed he would rather be assassinated on the spot than failing to preserve the nation on the Declaration's principles. This is what Lincoln said in Independence Hall. I am filled with deep emotion at finding myself standing here in the place where we're collected together, the wisdom, the patriotism, the devotion to principle from which sprang the institutions under which we live. You have kindly suggested to me that in my hands is the task of restoring peace to our distracted country. I can say in return that all the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, so far as I've been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall in which we stand. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and adopted that Declaration of Independence. I have pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and soldiers of the Army who achieved that independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. This is the sentiment embodied in that Declaration of Independence. Now, my friends, can this country be saved upon that basis? If it can, I will consider myself one of the happiest men in the world if I can help to save it. If it can't be saved upon that principle, it will be truly awful. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it. Upon conclusion of his speech inside Independence Hall, Lincoln moved outside to raise a new flag bearing an additional star for the newly admitted state of Kansas. The flag-raising ceremony ended what was for Lincoln an awe-inspiring and reverential visit to the sacred place where the Declaration was adopted. As it tragically turned out, Lincoln did give his life for the ideals embodied in the Declaration. Today, his commitment to those principles is a model worth emulating more than ever. Thank you.
Our final presenter, Edna Greene Medford, is Emerita Chair of the Howard University Department of History. She specializes in 19th century African American history and includes its many intersections with Abraham Lincoln. Edna is the current chair and past president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. She is the laureate of the Lincoln Academy of Illinois and has been awarded the state's Order of Lincoln Medal.
Thank you, John. On July 4th, 1861, President Lincoln addressed a special session of Congress as the country sank deeper into war. Only 4 months into his administration, he faced the greatest challenge to American union since the nation's founding. After the attack on Fort Sumter and other illegal activities taken by the secessionists and their sympathizers, he had acted without the consent of Congress, which was not in session during that time. Aiming to quell the rebellion, he had called for volunteers from each state to supplement the woefully inadequate federal military. He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus, an action that met with intense debate then and continues to be a source of criticism today. In addition, he had authorized military spending and the blockading of Confederate ports. Independence Day presented Lincoln with the perfect opportunity to explain to the American people the reasons for these executive actions. He indicated that what he did was necessary for the defense of the great American experiment in democracy. The struggle was not for America alone, it was for the preservation of democracy for future generations everywhere. Lincoln declared that in the years since the Declaration of Independence was written, America had shown that a government of, by, and for the people could be successfully established and administered. This war would determine whether democracy could be successfully maintained, quote, against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. He warned that if the Confederates succeeded, they would substitute the current government with one that abandoned the chief principles upon which the nation was founded. In contrast to the Founders' Declaration that all men are created equal, the secessionist founding document, quote, deliberately pressed out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people. And in words that evoked the promise of the Declaration, he explained that the war was, quote, a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of man, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. This was Lincoln's thinking, not just during the war, but throughout his public life. In his vision of America, everyone would have a chance to experience the life, liberty, and happiness recognized by the founders as unalienable rights. This was his understanding of the relationship between government and the governed in a democracy. Government was to be used to protect the people, not oppress them, to enhance their lives, not make them worse, to strengthen their rights, not undermine them. All citizens had a right to expect that the Constitution and the laws of the land would be used to those ends. Excuse me. Of course, the citizens Lincoln spoke of did not yet include the nearly 4 million persons of African descent still held in bondage in 1860, nor the more than 400,000 who were legally free but had few, if any, protections under the law. Democracy was of no value to them so long as slavery existed and tied all African Americans to it by race. The institution subverted democratic principles for both groups, denying the enslaved basic human rights and relegating the legally free to second-class status. Lincoln understood that slavery prevented the nation from honoring the words enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. He saw the institution as a monstrous injustice that robbed the nation of its just influence in the world. But since the Constitution protected property rights, the only way to eradicate slavery was through consent of the people or by following the path laid out by the founders. Prevent its expansion, and it would die naturally. When the war came, the opportunity arose to attack slavery directly. To save the nation, Lincoln struck at the heart of the Confederacy's strength. After unsuccessfully lobbying the border states to begin the process of abolition, and failing in attempts to get the seceded states to give up their bid for independence, he issued his Proclamation of Freedom. The decree authorized military emancipation in the seceded states and gave African Americans, freeborn and formerly enslaved, the opportunity to serve in this army of liberation. The proclamation was a limited strategic measure driven by military necessity rather than humanitarian concerns. Yet it was a crucial step toward universal abolition. When he appeared in Gettysburg several months later to commemorate the sacrifice of those who had died there, Lincoln acknowledged that the shift in the war's aim from preserving the Union to creating a more just society. He reminded the nation that America was conceived in liberty and committed to the equality of all men. He acknowledged the unfinished work that lay ahead, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, he said. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Of course, this reimagined America could only be realized by winning the war, restoring the Union, and ensuring that slavery would never again serve to divide the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, with its authorization of the use of Black troops, helped to secure Union victory by spring 1865. At the same time, an amendment outlawing slavery throughout the nation was making its way toward ratification after having been approved by Congress with critical assistance from Lincoln. Lincoln would not live to see the ratification of the 13th Amendment, nor the other Reconstruction-era amendments that attempted to secure Black rights. In 1857, he had railed against the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford. That it indicated African Americans were not citizens and had no rights that white men were required to honor. Now, in part because of his efforts during the war, the nation approved the 14th Amendment, which provided for birthright and naturalized citizenship, due process, and equal protection under the law. 2 years later, ratification of the 15th Amendment gave African American men access to the ballot. It was a goal Lincoln had supported, especially for Black veterans of the war. The amendment prohibited the state and national government from denying the right of a citizen to vote on the grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Although the Reconstruction amendments would be challenged by illegal and extra-legal means during the coming decades, Lincoln's decision to pursue a war in defense of union and freedom moved the nation closer to the kind of society he had imagined. Lincoln left us with something else as well. On more than one occasion, he had placed the task of preserving democracy squarely on the people. As he journeyed from Springfield to Washington to take the oath of office, he stopped along the way to greet crowds of well-wishers. At Indianapolis, he discouraged the audience from relying on public servants to save democracy and encouraged them to embrace their responsibilities as citizens. And, quote, "When the people rise in masses in behalf of the Union and the liberties of their country," he declared, "truly may it be said, the gates of hell shall not prevail against them. It is your business to rise up and preserve the Union and liberty for yourselves and not for me, not with politicians, not with presidents, not with office seekers, but with you is the question. Shall the Union and shall the liberties of this country be preserved to the latest generation?" When Lincoln uttered those words in Indianapolis, the nation was 2 months away from armed conflict, brought on by a threat to the Union and to the principles upon which America was founded. By July 4th, he was still trying to coax the secessionists back into the national family, while recognizing that the possibility of succeeding in this environment of open rebellion was rapidly failing. Yet he did not allow his beliefs in a better America to be compromised. The threats to democracy are perhaps somewhat different today, but Lincoln's words resonate as we struggle to safeguard our own liberties. His generation successfully met the challenge. It is now left to this latest generation to preserve democracy and ensure liberty by repelling authoritarianism and securing the equality of opportunity that Lincoln envisioned. Thank you.
We have only covered just a few of the Lincoln documents that reveal an earnest, profound, and lifelong commitment to embedding the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence into American fundamental law. At each phase of his career in politics, Lincoln was guided not merely by tactics, but by the principle for which he believed the founders in America stood. Some may think it an oversight not to have discussed his final prayer for the nation, his second inaugural address. But that is well enough known that by omission, it only serves to make our point. The Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural complete the thought of the great task that will perpetually remain the duty of the American people. As Dr. Medford has noted, Lincoln has charged the American people, each of us, to accept responsibility to carry the task forward and to work to ensure that our liberties shall be extended and preserved for all to the latest generation. We are grateful for the life of Abraham Lincoln, who completed the unfinished work of the Continental Convention of 1787 and set a course to be followed to keep our nation forever worthy of the saving. Lincoln is truly the last of the American fathers and deserves particular honor on this 250th anniversary of the American founding. Thank you for being with us today. For more information about Lincoln during this Declaration anniversary year, follow us on Lincoln250.org.